Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the event. This event is called Why Are We Losing Organic Farms? Understanding the Challenges and Charting a Path Forward. I know many of you, though not everybody here. My name's Abby Youngblood. I'm the Executive Director at the National Organic Coalition. And we were really happy to see so many folks interested in this topic and able to join us today. It's a difficult subject that we're discussing, and it's mostly because we just don't have all the answers yet about um, the why, and even not all the answers yet about what the data is telling us. But we wanted to go ahead and embark on the conversation, knowing that we don't yet have all the answers because we feel like it's important to put it forward to the organic community and to start talking about the trends that we're seeing. We do have this organic integrity database now with a lot of data in it. So my hope is that our presentations will help us better understand some of the recent trends that we're seeing with the number of operations and also point to areas where we need more research so we can understand and respond to what we're seeing in organic certification. As we get started, I'll just mention that the event is supported through the United States Department of Agriculture Transition to Organic Partnership Program, TOPP, and TOPP is part of USDA's Organic Transition Initiative. And I will also just share a few words about the National Organic Coalition. For those of you who maybe are less familiar with our work, we are a national cross-sector coalition. And so our membership includes farming organizations together with certifiers, food co-ops, and other kinds of retailers, several high integrity organic companies who are part of our coalition, plus consumer groups, environmental groups, and other advocates who support organic food and farming. And we've been working for more than 2 decades on protecting the integrity of the USDA organic seal, working for strong enforcement of the standards, and also protecting and trying to increase federal resources for organic agriculture. And I will just say this work is very important and essential in this moment, this work at the federal level. And we are very much activated and engaged in securing the future of the organic program right now. So if you're not yet involved in our coalition work and you'd like to learn more, and if you're an organization or company who would be interested in joining, we'd love for you to reach out to us. As we're getting started, I'll just share our plan for the afternoon. We have two presenters with us today. We're going to go first to Mallory Krieger, who will talk about some of the trends we're seeing in organic certification and who is exiting organic certification. And she'll be focused primarily on data from the Organic Integrity Database. And then we have Dr. Carolyn Dimitri from NYU, who will talk about how we can understand the why behind these exits, but also pointing to where the research gaps are, and as a researcher, how she looks at or is approaching this issue and where we might go next. We will have a chunk of time after that for some Q&A with our presenters. And then we do, for those who want to stay as an optional add-on, if you stay with us to the end, we will have some time for discussion and reflection on what we hear from the presenters in breakout rooms. We will hear report outs from the breakout rooms and then close the session at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we welcome you to stay for the whole time if you're interested, or if you just want to be here for the presentation portion, that's great too. So we have that optional discussion part at the end. We are asking that folks uh, tune into the community agreements that we have for the meetings that we convene. Many of you are familiar, but we ask that the group focus on our common goal. And today that's very much around trying to understand the trends that we're seeing. Also, that we use this event as a way of continuing to build uh, a community of trust and a community that's working together towards this common goal, and that we make space for the different opinions and perspectives that are in this room, um, knowing that folks come from different backgrounds and have different things to offer. So we'll create space for that. I also want to let you know that we have a resource page for this event. We were able to already put up the slides that Mallory is presenting, and we're going to put a link to that resource page in the chat box. So if you want to pull those slides up as she's presenting, you can also see them on your screen. We will also eventually put the recording up from today's session. We are making a recording, so that will go on our resource page. So feel free to access those resources that we've posted. And also feel free to engage in the session by putting questions, comments in the chat box. We do have a larger group today, and so we will just do our best to get to as many questions and comments as possible when we open it up for questions and comments. All right, let me introduce our speakers. Mallory Krieger is our first speaker, and she is the National Program Director for the Organic Agronomy Training Service, or OATS. And in addition to her leadership on organic issues, she has a background in data analysis with a master's in social statistics and research methods. And she also owns and operates an 85-acre farm in Fishhook, Illinois. And as I mentioned before, she is going to really hone in on some of the data from the Organic Integrity Database, and a little bit talk about some certifier reported information as well, to talk about who's leaving organic certification, where they're located, some of the characteristics, and what we do and do not know. Also, some limitations of the data that we have to work with. And second, we will hear from Dr. Carolyn Dimitri, an applied economist and a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University, NYU. I will say that prior to joining NYU, Dr. Dimitri was at the USDA's Economic Research Service for more than a decade, and she did a lot of research on organic, including consumer attitudes, consumer expectations. So she has a long history as a researcher on organic issues, and we're grateful that you're able to join us, Carolyn, and just share your perspective. You can help us broaden out a little bit to see some international trends, draw on some experience from the EU, but also draw on some insights from your research, the focus groups you've done with farmers, some of the other research that's out there. It's going to be maybe not a comprehensive look at everything that we know, but kind of touching on some of that research, and then thinking about how you look at this data that we have and how you look at where we go next in terms of how we better understand the issues. So I think it'll be very interesting. And I mentioned before, we'll welcome your questions and comments via the chat box and then open it up after we hear from both of the presenters to take those questions and grapple with them a little bit. So I will turn it over now to Mallory to start us off.
Thank you so much, Abby, and welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today with you. Bear with me for one moment while I get my slides sharing. All right, so you should be able to see my slides. Callie, can you give me a thumbs up? Excellent, thank you. Well, so I have taken a dive into the Organic Integrity Database to try to ascertain what it can tell us about who is entering certification and who is leaving certification, what their characteristics are, and then try to uncover what we can do as an organic community to support the farms that are leaving organic certification in the hopes that we can retain them going into the future. The objective of this analysis is to utilize the Organic Integrity Database to better understand who is voluntarily leaving certification so that we can craft a more effective retention strategy. For those of you who are not familiar with the under the hood inner workings of the Organic Integrity Database, it is managed by the National Organic Program and hosted on the USDA website. And it is an administrative database, which means it is a snapshot in time of the current certification status and characteristics of the operations that are in the organic program. So that includes certified operations, suspended and revoked operations, and surrendered operations. I pulled two data sets, one last year in November 2024, to do just an exploratory analysis for my own interests and also to help guide OATS's programming. So OATS is a fiscally sponsored program. We work with the Organic Trade Association. They are our fiscal sponsor. And our mission is to train advisors who work directly with organic producers so that organic producers have better access to trained technical support. So this exploratory analysis that I did in 2024 was intended to help guide OATS programming, try to figure out who is entering and leaving certification, where geographically are the needs for more advisor support. So that, one thing led to another, and here we are today. Abby asked if I would update that information and see what had changed over the last year. So I did a second data poll from the OID and on December 20th. So I'm working with two snapshots of information about organic producers in the United States. I limited the scope of this analysis to producers who are physically located in the United States. The Organic Integrity Database is global, so any operation that is certified to the NOP standard is listed in the OID, but I restricted it to operations in the United States. In order to be able to do this exploratory analysis, the data needed to be cleaned. There are a couple of unique features of the OID that create a bit of a challenge when it comes to comparing across time and even comparing within just a snapshot. One is that the operations in the OID do not have a unique identifier. They have an operation ID, but that ID changes in a number of circumstances that I'll discuss later in the presentation. But in order to be able to do a comparison over time between the 2024 and 2025 data polls, I generated a unique identifier for all of the operations and then use that to remove duplicate entries and match those operations over time in order to assess change. I want to put a disclaimer out there that it is not a perfect match, though I did the best that I could to get it as close as possible so we could make some exploratory comparisons. So within the Organic Integrity Database, or OID, the operations are listed with a certification status. The options for certification status are certified, surrendered, revoked, or suspended. The status changes for operations when they have an event that moves them from one status to the other. So status changes that increase the number of certified operations include new entries for certified operations who have just come into certification, as well as reinstatement of operations from a previous status of suspended or surrendered. There are also internal changes that happen within the OID where an operation is changing from one certifier to another, which triggers a status change because two administratively changed certifiers, an operation must surrender their previous certificate and then apply with the new certifier and be granted certification from them. So that generates multiple entries in the OID, which is a source of duplicate data. And then the certification statuses that decrease the number of certified operations in the database include leaving voluntarily by surrendering their certificate or being suspended or revoked, which exits from certified status. They stay in the database, but they're now listed as suspended or revoked. So the December 20th snapshot showed that as of December 20th, there were 28,881 certified operations in the United States. 4,218 operations were revoked or suspended, and 7,599 were listed as surrendered, for a total of 40,698 operations listed in the OID after the deduplication efforts that I put into the analysis. So looking more deeply at those status changes in 2025, for increases in our count of certified operations, 3,539 operations were newly certified. So big win in 2025. We added 3,539 operations. 60 operations were surrendered in 2024, but regained certification in 2025. So they changed their minds and came back into certification. And 15 operations were reinstated from suspension. Internal changes, we had 140 operations complete a change in certifier, which means they surrendered for their previous certifier and then recertified with a new one. For exits from certification, which is really where we want to drill in today, we had 306 operations that were newly suspended or revoked. So those were operations that in the 2024 snapshot were listed as certified, but then in the 2025 snapshot had become suspended or revoked. And then our status of interest today, voluntarily surrendered operations. There were 2,825 operations that voluntarily surrendered in 2025. Of those, 65 operations were listed as transitioning to a new certifier. As I mentioned before, they must surrender to be able to reapply. For the purposes of this analysis, I have included that 65 in the total count of surrendered operations because they may not complete recertification with the new certifier. And so until they do, we'll treat them as surrendered. So what does the OID tell us about these operations that are newly entering certification and voluntarily leaving? Well, some of the data that the certifiers collect and report to NOP through the OID are certification by scope. Not all surrendered operations have a status listed for the various scopes. So this is a subset of that 2,825 operations. For the exits, we see that the crop scope had 1,758 exits, while it had 1,605 entries by new certification. It is the only scope that saw a net loss. Livestock saw a net increase. So by net, I mean the entries by new certification minus the exits by surrender, so our net gain. Livestock had a net gain, and handling had a significant net gain. Wild crop had no change for exits or entries. So looking at the overall change, we see that crops lost 153 operations in the database, livestock gained 271, wild crop gained 0, and handling gained 916. Overall, the change is 792 operations. So that is new certifications minus new surrenders. I'll note that the net change in the chart does not sum to the overall net change. It is a higher number because there are operations that are listed in multiple scopes. So you may have a crop and a livestock operation. So one operation is listed in both scopes. So that is why that does not sum to 792. So we can also identify some characteristics by geography. The Organic Integrity Database contains address information for the operations. There are two addresses listed. One is a physical address, the other is the mailing address. Not all operations have a physical address, so for the ones that didn't, I used the mailing address. And an important limitation to note when looking at geography is that the address is for the office or headquarters of the operation. It does not indicate necessarily where production occurs. So acknowledging those limitations, the states that had the greatest losses in terms of net change are listed on the screen now. So Wisconsin and Iowa, Washington, Minnesota, and so on, all were the leaders in net change to the negative. I then did a calculation to contextualize the magnitude of that raw number. And so I looked at the total number of certified operations in each state and calculated the net change as a percentage of that. So we can see South Dakota sorry, South Dakota has a particularly high percentage of their certified operations that voluntarily surrendered in 2025. We can see that for the top 9 operations, all but Wisconsin were in double digits. For looking at the gains, so these are the big winners for the year. These states are the states that had the highest positive net change. We can see that in general, the magnitude of the net change is a bit smaller than with losses, but still very decent gains percentage. California led the pack, followed by New York and Florida. So I then exported all of the zip code data from the database and mapped it in Google Maps to see how the operations organized spatially across the United States. And I did not do a formal spatial analysis. I just loaded the pins into the map and took a look visually at clusters, and I will show some exports of those maps. But what I noticed was that the gains are clustered in and around large cities. Los Angeles, New York, Houston, and Seattle were ones that had particularly noticeable clusters of gains. I noticed that areas of losses tended to be in more rural areas. So California's Central Valley, the Midwest and Great Plains, the state of Wisconsin, particularly, and the state of Pennsylvania were all areas that had significant clustering of losses without associated clustering of gains in the same geographic area. So California, though California was the big winner for having the highest net gain, we can see an interesting spatial pattern emerging in the data. This is central California from Bakersfield up to Redding area. We have the San Francisco Bay Area where there's a significant cluster of green. The green pins indicate new entries to certification. The red pins indicate exits from certification by voluntary surrender. And so what I notice when I look here, metropolitan areas like around Sacramento, around the San Francisco Bay Area, further down in the Fresno area, have increases or have new entries into certification. But more rural areas have more red than green. So that indicates to me a question that could be looked at more closely with a more formal spatial analysis to see if there are statistically significant clusters happening in the data. Pennsylvania is another interesting case. We can see here in Philadelphia, there is a tight clustering of a lot of new entries into certification. But here around the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area, there is a large cluster of exits from certification and a little bit higher dominance of exits in rural Pennsylvania than new entries. Again, the state had a positive net change, but I found the clustering to be quite interesting. And it raises for me a question, what could be happening specifically in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area? This map, and I apologize that the state boundaries are difficult to see, but this map is of the Midwest. So we have Ohio here on the right, and then we have North Dakota just off in the upper corner down to Nebraska and Missouri. And what I notice when I look at this is there's clustering of green pins around metropolitan areas like the Twin Cities, like the greater Chicago, Milwaukee area, like the Detroit area. This is a static image, but I did zoom in to northeastern Ohio, and in the Cleveland metropolitan area, a large cluster of green pins, so new entries. But when I look at the rural areas, like in central Indiana, in rural northeast Ohio, in a large swath of rural Wisconsin, as well as rural Iowa and northern Missouri, there are a higher density of exits than there are entries. This I find to be interesting because when I look at the net gains and net losses, the scope that had a net loss was crops, and these are regions that would be more likely to be populated by crop producers. We can also do some descriptive statistics on acres. In the Organic Integrity Database, acres are reported for most operations. Acres have a lower probability of being reported for surrendered operations than for currently certified operations. But a large percentage, I wish that I had put the percentage on the slide now, but I apologize that I forgot to add that. But a large percentage of the operations did include acreage data. According to the December 20th snapshot, 7,742 acres are currently certified. 326,000 acres were reported for newly certified operations, so new in 2025, accounting for 4% of total acres. 366,603 acres were reported for newly surrendered operations, accounting for 5% of current certified operations. So we have, in 2025, the Organic Integrity Database reports a net loss of 40,585 acres to current certification status. I do want to acknowledge that I excluded the wild crop scope from all acreage calculation because the wild crop scope is under a different management type than an actively managed working land. And while there are a number of outlier large wild crop operations that dramatically skew the results, and so I made the decision to exclude the wild crop operations. So I took a look at the 2025 Organic Situation Report published by USDA ERS back in February of 2025. In that report, they used Argus Media estimates to try to uncover what the trends were by type of field in organic certification. And their data shows that up until 2023, there was an estimated loss of organic acres, specifically in pasture and rangeland. For non-field crop areas, it was holding fairly steady. And for field crops, we had an increase through 2021 and then a modest decrease going through 2023. I'm very curious to see if this analysis is repeated in the coming years to see what may have transpired in 24 and 25 with the trend. Does the trend continue to be associated more predominantly with pasture and rangeland, or do we see changes in acres in other use cases? Some additional information that the acres in the OID can tell us. So of the newly certified operations, I plotted a histogram of their size. So the y-axis is the number of operations that fall within the acre size in each bin. This far left bin is 0 to 10 acres. I excluded operations that had exactly 0 reported because there are operations that have a reported acre of the numeral 0. I excluded them from this analysis so that the mean and medians wouldn't be skewed by that null value. So over 400 operations are under 10 acres in size. So for the newly certified operations, a very large percentage of them are less than 10 acres. The right-hand tail of the distribution continues out to tens of thousands of acres. I have a bin on the right-hand side of 400 acres. So roughly about 140 operations are 400 acres or larger. The mean or average size of newly certified operations is 203 acres. The median is 51 acres. The median is significantly smaller than the mean, which tells us that we have a skew toward smaller operations with a very long tail of larger operations, pulling that average higher. Looking at newly surrendered operations, the distribution looks very similar in terms of the clustering at small operations. Of the newly surrendered, about 245 of them were 10 acres or less, and about 120 or so operations were 500 acres or greater. I find it interesting to look at the mean and the median for the newly surrendered acres. The mean or average is 355. When we compare that to the newly certified operations, it is larger. So the newly certified operations are 203, where the newly surrendered are 355. The median is also different. The median for newly surrendered operations is 59 acres, which means 50% of operations were larger than 59 acres and 50% were smaller. Comparing that to the newly certified operations at 51, this implies, though we can't know for certain because, as I mentioned, we do not have perfectly complete acreage data because there are blanks in the database, but it implies that the operations that are entering certification are smaller than the operations that are leaving certification. Something else that we cannot tell directly from the data with a quick exploratory analysis is how much of the change in total certified acres is due to changes within operations. So an operation removing some acres from certification or adding some acres to certification. This is only looked at in aggregate across all operations. That type of time series data is very difficult to do with an administrative database. So looking a little deeper in the acreage data, the list of states with the largest loss of acres are on the screen now. And the winner, so to speak, is Idaho, losing almost 92,000 net acres between the 2024 and 2025 database. And then that accounts for 32% of currently certified acres. So that's a very large loss for the state of Idaho. Oklahoma, in terms of percent of certified acres, is a close second at 24%. The remainder are Texas and Minnesota, which are large ag states themselves with double-digit percentage changes. The rest of the operations had modest percent changes in single digits. Another interesting statistic that I calculated was this graph or this chart is the list of operations that had the highest net change in operations. And I then included their net change in acres. And I found it very interesting that Wisconsin had the highest net change in operations at -36, but still had a net gain in acres. And that holds true for a number of these states. So that could imply a number of things. We cannot know for certain, but the questions it raises for me are, what are the causes of those increases? Are those caused by existing certified operations bringing more of their operation into organic? Is it caused by new operations coming into organic being on the larger size? There's a number of possibilities, but unfortunately, we can't know for certain with this data set. So some important limitations that I want to draw to your attention before I close my presentation. The Organic Integrity Database is a fantastic resource for organic, but for the purposes of this type of analysis, it's not structured in a way that lends itself to clean analysis because it is a snapshot database. It's an administrative database, not a statistical database. So some important limitations that I'd like to point out. One is that as the database is currently structured, there is no universal permanent identifier for operations. When an operation transitions to a new certifier, the operation ID changes 2 times. So they have an ID that is assigned to them with their original certifier. Then they get coded as transitioning to a new certifier in the certifier field. And then that generates a new operation ID. And then when they enroll with their or onboard with their new certifier, the operation ID changes yet again. And so the data, or the longitudinal quality of the data, is then obscured from analysis without doing some pretty intensive matching over years. There's also no permanent date of entry into the database that is available when you download the database. I'm sure that NOP and the certifiers have that, but it's just not in the data set that is publicly available. And so what that means is when a operation changes certification status, so say they change to a new certifier, when they go from being certified to that first surrendered, it changes the effective date of their status, effectively obscuring their whole history from view for us for analysis. So, for example, if a farm originally got certified in 2007 and they were with one certifier that whole time, when they change certifiers, it then appears that they've been certified since 2025. So it makes it much harder to do a longitudinal analysis. Additionally, old surrenders appear to be administratively removed from the database. So in the 2024 data pool, there were 3,540 operations that are not found in the 2025 data pool. The vast majority of them were surrenders that had dates listed for 2021 and 2022. And I noticed when I did my analysis of the 2024 data, a very similar cliff in 2020, 1 year prior. And so that indicates to me that there is some rolling off of old surrenders from the publicly available database. I've already talked quite a bit about the process for transitioning to a new certifier and how it creates duplicate entries. But to quantify that, in the 2025 data pool, there were 170 operations that had duplicate entries due to the transition to a new certifier process, which accounts for 6% of all surrenders. So it's a meaningful number that can skew analysis unless careful matching and deduplication is conducted. Additional limitations of the data. The address data is oftentimes inaccurate. Many of the addresses do not link to an official address in mapping services. Many of the addresses contain typographical errors. And one structural limitation that I've already mentioned is that not all of the operations have physical addresses listed. Many of them only have mailing addresses. And also, the addresses are for headquarters, so location data for production facilities and fields is not available. There are a number of typographical errors in operation name and address that I noted from 2024 to 2025 when I was doing the matching process. And then finally, product type is not reported for surrendered operations with really any regularity. So for almost all certified operations, you can keyword search product type that they're certified to sell, but that data is not necessarily reported for surrendered operations. And so unfortunately, I was not able to dig into what types of operations they are from a product standpoint. So given those limitations, the things that we wish we knew: product types for surrendered operations, length of certification status, production locations, acres for all operations, and trends over time, those total surrenders. So that total surrender number that I started off with in our snapshot data is what's currently listed, but I've identified over 3,000 surrenders that have rolled off of the database. So we don't know really how many are surrendering over time unless we go back to the old snapshot data that is available on the NOP website, but would require very rigorous and careful tracking and matching to ensure that the data that the operations were tracked correctly. So for my final slide, um, the Organic Integrity Database is a really great resource, but again, it's an administrative database, so there are limitations. So there are other places that we are collecting and can look at data on who is leaving certification, what their characteristics are, and more importantly, get to some of their why, some of their perception for why they might be leaving certification. Um, some of that data could come from NASS with the organic survey, but certifiers themselves collect a lot of robust data on their clients. And so Abby reached out to a number of certifiers, and three of them generously shared aggregated data with us for this analysis. And the top reasons that the clients who surrendered over the last several years for those operations, the top reasons that they gave were that they are no longer producing organic, which was defined by the certifiers as they were staying in business, they just were leaving certification. And that accounted for 40 to 50% of the surrenders. And then about 30% of the surrenders actually went out of business. So they didn't leave certification to farm in a different production method. They actually closed their farms. Some smaller percentages included cost of certification at 8% and too much paperwork or certification is too difficult at around 3%. About a quarter of the respondents in the data sets provided by the certifiers indicated no reason. So they didn't provide insight into that. Thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. Before I turn it back over to Abby, I will just note I have included all states' data for net change in operation and net change in acres in the slides that you can download at the link, but these are so small, and I figured I'll let you all dig into that at your leisure. So with that, I will turn it over to Abby.
That's awesome, Mallory, that you included the data for all the states because that was one of the number one requests coming through in the chat box that people were really interested in seeing it for the state that they're in. So that's super helpful to have that compiled. And there were a lot of questions that came up, but we're going to hold the Q&A until after Carolyn presents. But we wanted to just, before Carolyn starts her presentation, we wanted to give just a little bit of time for Carolyn and Mallory to engage with each other on the data that Mallory has just presented. And we wanted to give a chance for Carolyn to flag things that stand out or that she has questions about or would want to dig deeper on. So Carolyn, I'm going to kind of turn to you and see if there are things that came up for you as you were listening to the presentation that you would want to maybe discuss a little bit more.
Sure. I want to start, first of all, by saying, Mallory, this was an amazing amount of work, and you were very careful and very thorough. And I don't know if people recognize how much of a huge undertaking this was. So I commend you on that because I know this is not your full-time job, that you have other things that you do. And this was something that you did in your spare time. Um, and so I just have a few general things that popped into my mind. And so one is thinking about administrative data, because I think it's important for maybe people who are listening to understand, USDA has two kinds of data. One is statistical data, where they are specifically collecting information with the idea of being able to represent actually what's going on in the farm. And then administrative data is to keep track of a program. And so when they're keeping track of a program, they don't pay as much attention to cleaning up mistakes. And I think they don't think about these things of consistency that Mallory pointed out. So Mallory, I wanted to say, because Mallory and I chatted last week, and then I happened to just be at the NOP office between then and now. And so I asked about two of the questions that you had. One was the having like an inconsistent participant ID, and they had a reason. And I kind of think if you would ask that, I didn't really understand it. It had something, but I think that if you talked to the people at the NOP, they would tell you why it's done that way. Because I was, anyone who was a researcher that I talked to there, they were like, oh, yeah, of course. How is she supposed to do any work with this if she can't track farms over time? And then the other one I think Jenny did speak to at the NOSB meeting was using geocoded locations. And there are like Privacy Act implications for why they're not really able to do that. So I think it's also very brave of you to like go in and do this kind of analysis, knowing that your data is just going to like throw hurdles at you every now and then. I think that I have a, okay, so those are kind of my bigger picture questions or thoughts. And the other one was like, I would prefer to see your pins for handlers and producers separately because I think like when I look at a map and I look at the entities on there, I think like crop farmers are kind of driven by similar incentives, but handlers are driven by different incentives. And like maybe handlers pop up when there are enough crop farms nearby. I don't know. So like for that, and that may not be like a super huge amount of work for you to do is to make like two sets of maps. So I'll just stop there and you can say something about that.
Well,
Otherwise,
I'm glad to hear. I assumed that there were reasons to not have a permanent ID.
yeah.
It's just acknowledging limitation that it has for this purposes of this analysis. On the map side of things, that is possible for new entries, but it is not necessarily possible for surrenders. And the reason for that is a decently high percentage of the surrenders don't have a listing for what their what scope they were certified under, but there is still quite a few, and so it could be done. Just that caveat, that was one of the reasons I decided not to do it, was
Mhm.
because of the challenge in over interpreting that information.
Right. Because I think one of the comments actually mentioned something that I hadn't thought of before, but you probably have already thought about. It was with SOE, all of a sudden you were forcing a lot of handlers to get certified. So that might be so that might give you false information, like they're just complying with the regulation. So, and unfortunately, that would be 2024 and 2025, right? Like the 2 years you have data for. And I guess like the other thing that I was wondering about, is like if you think about US agriculture, there are so many tiny farms and so many big farms. So like the disparities that you showed for like farm size, like average and medium seemed fine to me. Like, were you surprised by that? Or like, I mean, that just seems like there's a lot of little farms to me, is the way I looked at that.
Yeah, um, I wasn't surprised this time, but I was surprised in 2024 when I first like cracked into the OID data. I for the 2024 data, did looked at a chart, or I generated a chart that showed a percentage, like a percentile ranking of operations, and 90% of acres are controlled by 10% of operations, roughly. And so that statistic did surprise me a little bit. But then as I got to thinking about it and I looked at broader agriculture data in the US, that is somewhat aligned, maybe not perfectly, but it's somewhat aligned with general agriculture data, that we have a lot of very small farms in the US, and then a small number of farms are the biggest producers of agricultural products in the US. And
Yeah.
so organic is no different there.
Yeah, I agree with you with that one. And then I was really interested in like the acres. And so I'm assuming on the charts that you showed with acres, that was just crop and livestock farms, and you just like pulled the handlers out of that particular analysis.
Handlers don't have acres listed, so they would be excluded by not having acres listed, but there would be handlers represented there if they were certified in crop and livestock scope as well.
A farmer handler, yeah. So I know that that for some reason, even though SOE, I think, is that where the acreage requirement comes from? Was that an SOE requirement, or maybe it was an,
Think so?
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
Abby's shaking her head, yes.
Yeah, well, in any case, I know that in this chat that I had with the NOP, they were like, they were aware of the fact that many farms did not have their acres listed and they didn't know why. And they're going to fix that somehow in some time. So that should give you hope too. More work for you to do. Um, I guess like those are my big overarching questions. I mean, I think you did a really nice job of showing what was going on and, the things that you wish we all wish. Like if you could go back 10 years, like, is this a representative year? But I think, another way of looking at it is you have a really good baseline now for going forward. Yeah, great. Nice work, Mallory.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we will go ahead and move to Carolyn's presentation. I am doing my darndest to keep track of the many questions that have come through in the chat. Some are questions about the data, some are, I wish we had X. Um, so we'll try to get to some of those topics, but we want to move next to Carolyn's presentation.
Okay, so this will be very quick. I just wanted to give people a little bit of background about things that we know about why farms decide to become certified and then why do they decide to give up certification. So Kelly, you can move to the next slide. So again, it's like there isn't a really robust body of literature on these particular questions. But one of the most interesting recent papers I saw, I think Abby listed on the resource page, it followed a bunch of farmers through like an NRCS program, and they were working towards transitioning to organic. And so at the end, some farms did opt for certification, but some farms opted not to get certified. And so the reasons that the farmers in this particular NRSCS program that worked with Stevenson, and the site is listed at the bottom of this page, the farmers gave for wanting to become organic producers, they put it into these two categories, these values-based reasons, which have to do with like human health, land stewardship, environmental health, and economic reasons, where they saw that as an opportunity to make more money. And in fact, if you look at the research, it does show that most organic farms are more profitable than most non-organic farms. Okay, Kelly, you can switch to the next slide. So in that particular study, when they compared the people who decided to certify and those who did not certify, what they found out is the ones who chose not to certify found it harder to manage pests and disease. They were worried about the cost of labor. They weren't able to get the organic price for their products, and they didn't really have an access to good markets, including organic handlers. And the cost of certification and record keeping were barriers. And usually it isn't just one reason. It's like a combination of all these reasons, and it just doesn't work for people to actually go through and become certified. Okay, next slide, Kelly. And then the ones who give, and then they also talk to farmers who gave up certification, or excuse me, these are different studies that look at farmers who give up certification. And most of these studies took place in like Canada and the European Union, because they actually subsidize the transition to organic. And in many cases, too many farms converted, and then they just decided it wasn't for them. And so in these particular studies, which look at Spain, Italy, and Quebec, the main reasons were given where they couldn't get the organic price, they couldn't find markets, the negative experience with inspectors. Like I've even encountered that in some of my research studies. Like when a farmer has a negative experience with an inspector, it's like very bad for the operation and the farmer doesn't really often want to continue with, working with someone who doesn't treat them well. Some farmers found that farming organically was more difficult than they expected. And the cost of certification and record keeping is something they didn't really want to do. And the interesting thing to think about is that often when a farm leaves organic certified or gives up its organic certification, it happens usually in the first 5 years. And The biggest year is the third year. So think it's 3 years for transition and then 3 years of farming organically. And like that is the key moment when most farms are going to give up their certification. And for some of the farmers that entered for economic reasons, they felt that they had unmet expectations, that they thought it would be easier to farm organically. They would be better, they'd be able to get better prices, they would have better profits. And like when those are not met, then I think farmers just say, like, I'm not going to do this. I'm sorry for the varying fonts. I didn't. Um, anyway, okay, the next slide, please, Kelly. And then the last thing I want to talk about is I did focus groups with Andy Pressman from NCAT and Lydia Oberholzer, who's an independent consultant, and this work was funded by the OREI. We did focus groups with 8 different types of farmers. So we did them over like maybe a 15-month period. We did it during the lockdown. It kept us pretty busy. And what we found from these focus groups that if you were a direct marketer and you were an organic farmer, you had to spend a lot of time talking to your consumers about why they should pay more for your apples or your carrots than, the vendor down, the alley. And that in some locations, like in the Southeast, it's really hard to be an organic farmer. But in the Northeast, and this is kind of related to what Mallory showed, where you have these operations coming around cities with like that are population dense, Northeast farmers tend to do much better as organic farmers. And those are tied to like having a population with higher incomes, and then they're willing to pay for organic food and they see the value in it. Access to processing for livestock in particular is problematic. A lot of organic farmers that have split operations gave up their livestock certification because they couldn't find an organic processor, and didn't see any sense in paying for the certification at the production end. And farmers also found it really hard to find buyers who are willing to pay fair organic prices. And one of the, I know the farmer that made this comment is actually on this call today. So we'll see if this farmer recognizes their comment. That especially for grain farmers, that there were these mixed messages from handlers saying, grow more, we need this, and then they won't pay more for the product. And so there are these sort of mixed signals and disincentives throughout the market. So this is kind of like a background of the literature. I think, is there one more slide, Kelly? No. Okay, good. Um, yep, that's all I have to say about that. And I'm ready to turn it back to you, Abby.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation as well. And we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A with both Mallory and Carolyn. And I'm going to ask for a little bit of help from my colleague, Steve Ela, who can help monitor the chat box, because if you haven't had a chance to put your question in the chat box or your comment, you can do that now. We're going to go to some of the questions and comments that have come in while folks have been listening to Carolyn and Mallory present. Um, so I think you've kind of answered this, Mallory, but one of the questions I'm going to start with is if we wanted to get a greater look back, um, if we wanted to know how long how long has this trend of losing crops operations been going on, and we wanted to look farther back in the OID, can we do that? How would we do that? Do we know anything looking farther back in time?
Yeah, so the NOP has archives of snapshots of the OID that they put, I believe, monthly into the archive, as well as annual snapshots. And so theoretically, we could generate a unique identifier, like an artificial unique identifier for all operations, and then go through and deduplicate the data and then see those trends over time by looking at what happened in each year with each operation. But in doing that, it gets really noisy because with each year we have potential compounding errors. Like from 24 to 25, I had several hundred operations that I had to go in and manually match because there were typos in the address or typos in the operation name when it was manually keyed in. And so that makes it challenging. But I'm curious if he wouldn't mind me asking him directly. But Tom Chapman, I know that you have been playing with this and looking at older snapshots of the OID, and I'm curious whether you have an answer you'd like to offer to that question.
Yeah. Thank you, Mallory, for calling on me. And like, thank you for all the analysis you've done. It's fantastic. This is the first time I've seen it presented in this way. And all the challenges you brought up, we've seen, if not a few more. And so one example of a challenge we see is actually on when a certifier switches between certification agents. So they're not losing it, but they're switching. You said that data resets to the year they got recertified. That's how it is in most cases, but not all. There's a couple certifiers who actually track the original one, which is almost more difficult because now it's not consistently new. There's this inconsistency in the way data gets presented. And that administrative versus like statistical way of using data is one of the biggest challenges we're struggling with to find these challenges. But our approach so far, as we've been analyzing the data, has been very different. We've been looking at those individual years, those snapshots, and then comparing the differences. There's some advantages to this and a lot of disadvantages. The advantages are when surrendered acres go away, we can go back and look at that same ID for the year that they were last certified and get a sense of like what is the true amount of surrender going away and where that's happening. But the challenges you see with those shifting IDs gets compounded because we're now working with a database that's 70,000 entries, not just 700,000 entries, not just 70,000. And so we've had a lot of difficulty trying to track an operation through time. There's also just a lot of other weird abnormalities. What happens when a farm splits apart and gets divided amongst say 3 family members versus sticking with one. We've seen that happen. So then an ID gets, there's two new IDs, but it's really the same farm being divided up. And so there's just challenges abroad in cleaning up this data. It's an amazing source, but I think we're all just still dipping our toes in and trying to figure out the trends that we're seeing.
Yeah, thanks for adding that insight, Tom. And while we've got you here, there is a question that I think probably both of our presenters could answer, but also you're well positioned to answer. The question that came through just a moment ago in the chat box is market demand declining in the US? And of course, it's different for different types of products, but we do know from OTA's work a lot about market demand for organic. What can you say about that point?
Yeah, the market demand is not declining in the US, but at a retail level, but there's so much nuance. I go back to the Mark Twain quote, which I think he took from someone else. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so, the data and these numbers only tell you so much. We're very much focused on acreage, and acreage is a really high level number. But organic over indexes at the retail market quite heavily in specialty crops and under indexes quite heavily comparative to the total market in meat products. And then when you layer that into what you would expect to then see in acreage data, specialty crops take up less of US acreage than crop and rangeland or field crop and rangeland in particular, because we under index so heavily in beef, in organic beef, so much heavy compared to the overall consumption of beef, that we see that same under indexing in rangeland as well. So the percent of acreage as we're reporting it now, like it's a metric. It's one that we all want to understand. We're all dedicating resources to trying to understand it, and yet it still has very severe limitations until you can get down into these more nuanced areas of where we're seeing crops succeed and where we're seeing challenges in crops.
Thanks, Tom. Let me try to go to a couple other questions that have come through. There was a question much earlier that I'll throw to you, Mallory, that is are specific certifiers losing a higher amount of growers? Do we have that data? I don't know how much you've looked at that or what you can say about that, but can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not in a position right now to list specific certifier names because I don't have the data in front of me. But yes, we can see that in the data. When I did the analysis in 2024, that was one of the things that I looked at was comparing certifier rate of both suspension and revocation, but then also surrender. And there are some certifiers that have a significantly higher percentage of their overall operations choosing to leave than others.
Yeah.
We've seen that as well.
And I'll just nuance that there could be a lot of different reasons for that. Some certifiers are geographically based. And so there may be trends in certain parts of the US or with certain types of operations that are in certain places in the United States. Again, I think it highlights some of what we don't fully understand about the why. I was trying to group some of the questions as they came in, and I have this category of things that we wish we knew, and you had a slide on that, Mallory. But two things that were in this category of things that we wish that we knew, and I am going to pull those couple of things, and I see lots more coming in. So, Steve Ela, I might turn to you after this to capture some of the questions coming in. But one person noted it would be really interesting to know the demographics and the age of the farmers and how sort of this relationship between when land is transferring or when farmers are retiring, what happens to the operation at that point. And I don't know if any of you can comment on if we know anything about that or how we might look at that issue a little bit more closely.
I mean, I would say that you need to embrace the OID for what it is. It is an administrative database. I think there's some of these improvements that Mallory outlined that could make it better data source for us. But for sources like that, I would still refer us back over to the NAS data resources where they collect that kind of demographic data in their data collection overall. And you can see some of those trends and pull from it what you will.
I
Yeah,
think one
and that's a little outside the scope of what we've covered in this. I don't
Yep.
know if anybody has anything that they've been able to look at around that in NAS data. It's also, as advocates, something that we're thinking about when we communicate with NAS about what we want, what questions we want them to ask in their survey. But Carolyn, you were going to say something. Please go ahead.
I was, I think one thing that you could do is you can see how many operations are in the OID, and then you can see how many are in the organic census. And you probably can infer from that that NAS is under reporting the organic sector. So I think like if I was going to make a big push for NAS, it would be to do a better job of getting data from organic farmers. And I think like maybe for the kind of questions that Tom was talking about, maybe that's for like the ERS NAS, the ARMS, Agricultural Resource Management Survey does collect more of that detailed data and they can look at more targeted questions. And again, they would need to be doing a better job of getting organic farmers into that survey.
Yeah. So one thing we've seen with the NAS data. So, I mean, again, these are different data sources and different reasons for collecting the data, right? But if you go back to 2021, the last NAS data source, they report 4.9 million acres, right? And 2024, we're seeing 7.7 million acres ish. We're not saying there was a growth during that time period at that rate. It's different methods for coming up with the data estimates that you're using. And NASA's is much more of a statistical estimate. They do a surveying. You can dive into the report. You can see how many organic folks have responded to their survey. But where they have known data, they make it match because they don't need to do that projection to fill in the gaps of where they're missing. So if you look at the overall number of operations, they've always estimated that correctly because the OID has existed in that space for that entire time of the recent NAS surveys. Um, But so the NAS data has its shortcomings, but it is a pretty powerful tool, especially because they keep their statistical methodology consistent throughout the years to look maybe not at that sizing estimate, but at the changes over time. And I think that's where like each of these data have their own applications, and it's dangerous to try to compare between the two of them. But NAS is really good at, is the organic farmer getting older or are they getting younger? Is the overall acreage that they're reporting the best number? I don't know. But some of those like comparative changes over time, I think, are really where that database excels.
I mean, as a researcher, I'm just going to disagree with you a little, Tom, because
Okay.
I think they should accurately report how many
Oh, I
acres.
do. I agree with you with that. It
Okay,
just
all right, okay.
a
Like,
100% agree with you. They should accurately report it, and I'm happy to see the OID report this because I think it's going to force NAS to get more accurate. It's going to be really interesting to see how they correct themselves in the 2025 one for acreage now because it wasn't consistent previously. They were underreporting it. Yeah.
I'm gonna
Sorry that you come across, Carolyn. I'm 100% on the same page with you.
um, thank you both, and I welcome any disagreements, but it sounds like on that one we're actually aligned. But it I'm going to steer us in a slightly different direction with another comment that came through. One of our participants said it would be really interesting to know how many of these organic operations that are surrendering are just leaving farming in general? And certainly we know that that's a huge trend line, right? In all of agriculture, just how hard it is to stay in farming, how much farms are propped up by off-farm income to be able to farm. And so I don't know that we fully got at that. You, Mallory, kind of referenced that a little bit from the certifier data.
Mhm.
But do any of you have comments on how much of the trend of people leaving organic certification is just a trend of people leaving farming? What can we say about that, or how could we get more information about that?
A great question. The only data that I had access to for today's presentation that got at that was the certifier, the aggregated certifier data of the reasons that were cited by operations as they exited certification, and about 30% of them cited that they were leaving farming, that they were closing their business. Um, so I'm not as familiar with NAS and ERS data to know whether there's anything there that could point to this. I'm curious, Tom, Carolyn, if either of you.
well, I did identify as one of the most important questions is to better understand who is leaving and why in the US. And like, is this constant over time? Is it that people are aging out? I mean, anecdotally, which is not very helpful, most smaller scale producers that have told me they gave up their organic certification were continuing farming, but that could also be age dependent. Because in our focus groups, we talked to a lot of older farmers who didn't know what they were going to do with their farms. So they were farming, and like I guess if there was a next generation to take over, they would have already passed it along. So I think maybe we're in for like a very weird period coming up ahead.
Yeah, it's a really good question that I do not have an answer for. In looking at the data, we know we are losing farms and farmers in all of U.S. agriculture, and we believe we are losing farms and farmers in organic as well. How much is unique to one or part of the larger trend? That's where I don't have an answer or knowledge.
Yeah, and could I jump in right there too and just ask related to that? I mean, Mallory, your data, 30%, going out of business, 40%, just not growing organically anymore, but only a very small percent saying cost or burden were big issues. Yet that is the word on the street. Do you have any sense of that, or Carolyn or Tom?
I'd like to speak to that. That stood out to me too when I was looking at the certifier data. And the one thing I would say is those really needed to be two separate questions because someone could be just reporting, I am surrendering because I'm not going to grow organically anymore. Others may choose to answer the why question and have it assumed that they're staying in farming. So they're not, it's not a well-constructed dichotomy. So I don't think we can
Right.
infer much from that.
The only thing to add on the inference level is we survey in our market surveys. So this is more on the retail side. This is not generally hitting many on the farm side, Steve, but what their biggest burdens to organic are. And I would say the cost comes up in it, but that's a cost of components, the ability to sell it at a profitable margin. There's a lot in there to dissect that's hard. Cost and availability remain a high one. What is clearly low, though, is the regulatory burden. That is not a top reason for someone saying this is a burden for me to be leaving or maintaining organic in my offerings.
I will say my research echoes that also. Most farmers actually said, if we're having a good business, then we're going to keep records and that will make us more profitable. And I think it was access to markets and getting a fair price for what they're selling and
Yeah.
not being like pushed down to like their reservation price.
Hmm.
Yeah. I want to flag this. This isn't a signal to the certifiers on this call that we should be upping the regulatory burden, and like that burden is real, and we shouldn't be adding costs where it's not bringing the same value to the oversight system. But that being said, that kind of story out there that this is really the issue or this is what's preventing organic from growing, it doesn't seem, from what we can see, to be the driver.
Yeah, thank you for offering that. And certainly access to markets, having good market signals that pull people into organic, that's something that we've been talking about. We also have been thinking a lot about something that's come up many times now in the chat box around fraud. Having a fair marketplace, having fair rules that are adequately enforced, of course, imports, but also domestic fraud. Those are issues that we've been working a lot on. And I was interested to see the livestock numbers. I thought that we might see loss in both crops and livestock. I may have even said that until we took the closer look at this data, that that's the trend that we thought we had been seeing. I know we've had some improvements in enforcement of livestock, so that's I don't know how big a factor that is, but I don't know if anybody here wants to comment on issues of fraud, enforcement, or broader issues around the marketplace and the signals in the marketplace and how those relate to the decision to get into organic.
And I would just toss in on that. There's been a couple comments of conventional prices being higher than organic with that, which all goes together. Just to,
Yeah. I mean, I would like to comment on livestock before you go into the fraud discussion. And I wonder if it isn't like beginning farmers are often livestock farmers. And I wonder if this is what is also happening in organic as well. So then that means you would have like a boost in the number of organic livestock farmers.
I had the same thought. I would also like, before we go into fraud, to comment on the question about the cost of certification and record keeping being a barrier. And I hear that word on the street too, but I wonder if there is a difference in motivations between people who are trying to convince to come into certification as compared to people who are making the decision to leave certification. I, from an intuitive level, would expect that it would be more of a barrier to entry than a barrier to retention.
And the research actually supports that, Mallory, that when farmers think about becoming an organic farmer, they feel like, oh, how do I do it? There's all this paperwork, there are all these things. But then when they are doing it, it's just a thing that they do, and it isn't really a barrier at that point in time. I mean, I'm sure they would like the cost to be lower, but most people seem to be, it's like part of doing business.
We have found that true also in frankly, the handling side of things, where with SOE, we're talking with a lot of folks newly introduced into needing organic certification. And they were thinking it was all this paperwork and all this effort. And it's like, no, you already have FSMA systems. You now just need to add an organic lens on top of that. It actually, follows a lot of the work you're already doing in other areas. So, back to the livestock numbers first. Not all livestock's the same. We need to point that out. So I think a lot of us are jumping to maybe saying dairy, but under these livestock areas is also poultry for layers, poultry for broilers. It's it's beef cattle, it's the whole gambit. And so you have to start breaking that apart. And that's also a challenge with the taxonomy and the OID database because those crop certs are fairly black and white, the certification scopes. But once you get underneath those, trying to get to a consistent taxonomy has been challenging. And NOP has a taxonomy out there, but it's voluntary and it seems to have very low compliance in usage. That being said, dairy and layers, we think, and we've been working on this. We're looking at these 10-year snapshots going back a decade and then trying to analyze then what's in the scope certification and seeing if we can, at a high confidence, pull out an operation that we think is a laying operation, pull out an operation that we think is a broiler operation, pull out an operation that we think is a dairy operation. We're trying this across the board. Those three, we have a fairly high confidence that we're getting a fairly accurate number. And the stories amongst those all are different. We've seen layers from 2016 increase, decrease, increase, decrease, increase. And we saw, dairy increase up until I think 2017 and then decrease steadily until 2024. And then we now see it increase again in 25. That's what the data is telling us. We can layer on. I don't have that straight causation to what it is. We're not, engaging in that kind of level of data science to figure out what it is. But the dairy market, we know for a long time was oversupplied. It had depressed pricing. And then when you layer on top of that the feedstuff crisis, and you kind of see that then playing out in those numbers. You see dairy's leaving. Now you see shortages in the retail market space on dairy, prices higher, feedstuff, prices decreased for whatever reason, not commenting on that being positive or negative, but that's the reality of the marketplace. And you see dairy now increasing because it's a bit more lucrative in that space. So, but there's multiple components that go into this is again where I'm going back to that, Mark Twain of lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's only going to tell you so much because you need to understand all those dynamics that will go into whether a marketplace is being successful for a farmer or not. Is it competition? Is it cost of inputs? Is it marketplace? Is it efficiencies that are driving down supply even though demand is going up? We've heard from a lot of crop producers say in California that they have reduced their loss in post-harvest handling and increase their yield outputs and losses at harvest. And so they just don't need as much acreage in organic as they had before, not because they're not selling more or producing more, but because they're losing less in the process in the supply chain.
Yeah. It's really nuanced and just based on the turnout at this event, Tom, it sounds like I think there's interest in a part two that's that livestock piece specifically. I think people are interested in digging in and I just want to make a comment too. We're kind of to the end of our Q&A, but I want to make a comment about the USDA Organic Transition Initiative and invite any final thought that any of the folks here want to share as we close out this part of it. But, the Organic Transition Initiative has been going on just for a few years, and it's been really phenomenal to have that type of support. And there have been two components to it. This piece that's been focused on market development, strengthening storage, processing, transportation, other kinds of infrastructure so that U.S. organic farms and businesses can respond to the demand in the marketplace. And that investment really helps make sure that U.S. producers are able to really participate in that demand for organic in the marketplace. So that's one piece. And then, of course, the other piece of the Organic Transition Initiative has been this Transition to Organic Partnership Program. And, that has provided really important support. I think getting at some of what you were talking about, Tom and Mallory, with the difference between a producer that's thinking about going organic, what kind of support they need, mentorship, helping connect producers to resources and recognizing that some parts of the US are really underserved. So I just wanted to point out how valuable the Organic Transition Initiative has been with those two different components, the market side and the top side. And, um, the impact of that initiative, it's still very new, but kind of the lessons we can learn from that. And also pointing out that USDA has exhausted all of the funding that they allocated for the market development. There was a lot of demand for that, for those resources, and TOPP is sunsetting at the end of 2026. So our groups are thinking about what comes next, and there are some pieces of legislation, the Domestic Organic Investment Act and the Opportunities in Organic Act, that would look at taking pieces and continuing that kind of support at the federal level. So I just want to point that out, and that we're not going to spend today talking about that, but that's a part of the equation. And you can tune in to some of the resources that NOC and OTA and other groups have to think about some of those resources that would help support that work.
And
Um,
Abby, could I just jump in real quick and just there have been a ton of comments in the chat and really rich conversation. We obviously can't get to them all, but we will preserve a lot of that. We're going to keep a lot of this data without names attached. But I just want to really thank everybody for the thoughtful comments they put in response to questions, and the back and forth is really valuable. And I do want to say there was one question that we didn't get to Carolyn about the how important government support is to transitioning farmers. And I think the program addresses that. So sorry we didn't get to that, but I think that is a question that we can continue as compared to the EU and other places. So go ahead, Abby.
I want to thank both Mallory and Carolyn, who have been trying to respond to people in the chat box in real time, and maybe we can have a little bit more of that. But also, I think um, Carolyn has put her email I see in the chat. So if you want to be able to continue the conversation, or you had a question that didn't get answered, I know there are several items we didn't get to. Any final thoughts, Mallory, Carolyn, Tom, anything that you want to make sure you say that you haven't had a chance to share?
I
No,
do.
I just Oops,
Oh,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Carolyn.
You
You have the
go
floor.
ahead.
Oh,
You
I
go.
was just gonna say I'm just so thankful to have been a part of this conversation, and I look forward to getting deeper in the weeds and the breakouts. But Carolyn, you have something on
Yeah,
topic.
let's
So
let's end let's end on you, Carolyn, because yours is going to be better than mine.
Okay, I
My quick
okay.
call out is just the NAS survey that we were speaking about that Carolyn was calling out is currently open. So it takes two to tango in this. We need farmers to complete it as well. So please complete it. If we're not in the numbers, we're not in the conversation. Please complete it if you're a farmer. Please spread the word and encourage farmers to complete it if you work with organic farmers. I put a link to it out there, but they mail it out to every individual farmer. You have to have your own code going in or in and complete the survey. But please encourage that so we get as wide of representation as possible in this next set. Carolyn,
I
take
mean,
us home.
I echo that as a researcher. And then, of course, my research head is thinking this top program, I think that will actually give us a chance to do some really good research on understanding whether programs like TOPP are better at keeping farmers in the sector than, having nothing. So we almost have like a control, that a natural experiment. So the future, I don't know who's going to do that work, but I hope it's someone. And I hope you're all part of it. And thanks for a really fun conversation, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn, Mallory, Tom, for being pulled in, and Steve, Ela as well. I want to say thank you for the really fabulous overview of the data. That was some really heavy lifting, Mallory, that you did, and we're grateful for that. And just being able to bring in your perspective as a researcher, Carolyn, is super valuable. Um, Now we know we have a large group, and we're going to kind of move to something that's a little bit more discussion based and participatory for those of you who are eager to keep talking or reflecting. So if you would like to stay, this is optional, but if you'd like to stay, we're going to break out into some discussion groups. And we have four different topics that we are going to spend about 35 minutes in breakout rooms on these different topics, and give folks first just a chance to reflect on what they heard. Was there anything that stood out or was striking? And also, does it jive with what you are seeing on the ground or in your own lived experience? And then we'll have also some discussion that's specific to these four topics: research, education, the TOPP program, the Transition to Organic Partnership program, and also talking a little bit about policy. Each of the breakout rooms will have a facilitator and a note taker who will kind of help us keep on track and capture some ideas. And then we will come back for report outs from each, very brief report outs from each of the breakout rooms. So in the research one, Steve Ela will be facilitator. Dr. Dimitri will join as well. And we'll just talk about, how do we strengthen the research and data that we need to understand more of the why behind the exits. In the education one that Mallory is going to facilitate, we're going to talk about how what we know about farms that are exiting, how that could inform education, training, technical assistance that we provide to farms. So hopefully we're responding in real time before farms exit, and helping prevent some of those exits. And then the top one, I will help facilitate, and we'll talk about how the transition to organic partnership program can play a role in addressing some of the issues that we're seeing. And then Steve Etka will facilitate the one on policy to talk about things like the cost of certification, farm viability, and other issues where maybe policy choices or changes in USDA programs might help reverse exits from organic. So, welcome back. I think folks are just returning back from their breakout rooms. Um, and I hope that you were able to meet some people that maybe you haven't met before and have an interesting conversation. Um, as folks are jumping back into this main room, we are going to take some time to hear some report backs from each of the breakout rooms. And we are going to give each room like about 4 minutes or so to just share a few of the key takeaways. And we're going to go in the order that's on the slide there, starting with the research breakout room. Um, and I'll try to help keep us on track. But I see, Gordon, I see that you're here to share that report back, and Steve Ela as well. So go ahead and kick us off with what you talked about in that room.
Yeah. So first we start off with just like kind of what surprised folks and then, pulling out some of the things that research is needed. And one of the big like surprises that I think was kind of reoccurring in a lot of the comments was just the almost like seeming disconnect between some of the findings and data, right? You know, one example is like organic operations are more profitable, but a lot of operations are leaving because of the economics of farming in general, right? And another might be just the growth of the livestock sector with the potential decrease in like crop and just the like supply challenges that that's going to present. But then uh, in terms of kind of looking at the research needed, a lot of it, from what I was hearing, was just looking at the economics of the operation and making the economic case for this type of farming. Um, you know, Someone that is very passionate about payment for ecosystem services. That topic also came up about the possibility of those types of systems, and we did have someone from Costa Rica on in our room who they have an active one of those programs that's doing some really great things to compensate farmers to maintain this type of production method. Um, but I think that was like the kind of big overarching themes was just, the seeming disconnect in the market that exists right now, and then trying to get a better understanding of the economics of the market and the sector in general. We have done a lot of advances in agronomic research and agronomic understanding of operation. Definitely not where it needs to be, right? It's been underinvested for decades, but um, you know, given the maturation of the sector, there just needs to be more economic tools, it seems, for farmers and us as advocates to make the case for this type of production method. And Steve, I don't know if I missed anything there.
No, thanks, Gordon. You did great. I think, the ecosystem payments, the economic side, and then, still just trying to understand really, beyond general loss of farmers, period, conventional and organic, what are the pain factors? But and we did talk a little bit about, coming in versus going out, maybe different things in terms of quote unquote the burden and cost. But Gordon really captured it perfectly.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Steve, and to everybody who participated in that conversation about the research aspect and for pulling out the need to better understand what's going economically and what type of support producers need on that side. We will go next to the education breakout. I know Mallory and Harriet were both in that session, and I don't know which of you is going to do the report back, but we've got both of you.
We're going to tag team it a little bit. I'm going to start off and Harriet's going to play cleanup. So, our topic on education hit on a number of different angles to it. We started off with posing the question, educating who? Consumers or advisors or farmers themselves. And so we kind of just went around raising hands and letting people have an opportunity to say their ideas. And so kind of just running down the list of ideas. One topic was consumers. One of our participants noted how difficult it is as a farmer to convince consumers that they need vegetables, let alone the importance of organic or the difference between organic and the conventional vegetables that they buy. Another person noted inspector training, particularly around soft skills, and she noted the difference in experience for both the inspector and the farmer when an inspector goes in with kind of more rough, soft skills, being a little bit more, I'm going to hound out all of the fraud and I'm sure I'm going to find it here, as compared to more of a collegial mindset and more of a we cannot consult, but we can help you understand the rule type of mindset. And that for those frustrations with the inspection experience may lead a farmer to leave organic certification. There were a number of people who noted prejudice about organic in rural communities being a barrier to opportunity and a barrier to actually initiating organic certification for a farmer who otherwise might be willing. Systemic challenges in agriculture also came up. And so talking about things like cost of infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, cost of equipment, cost of production, and the need for education on healthy, diverse ecosystems and their role in farm profitability. And then we talked about the need for community of organic farmers and how a lot of the systemic issues and the prejudice against organic issues are smoothed out when there is a community to lean on and to be a part of. And so there were suggestions around joining Farm Bureau and Farmers Union and local conservation agencies. And then one comment about price of organic corn, soybeans, and wheat has been low in recent years, which has slowed transition in one region that was seeing more farmers transition. Some of our conversation moved a little bit away from specifically about research, but more the struggles that farmers are facing. Harriet, is there anything I missed?
Yeah, well, it just that there was just kind of like lack of governmental support. And if you're Secretary of Agriculture in your state, kind of feels that organic is just a marketing ploy, it's going to filter down to, the extension and the various, the Farm Service Agency Committee and the local county committees and it just, the NRCS it just kind of filters through that Basically, it's kind of hard enough to be an organic farmer, especially transitioning when you're kind of changing your whole outlook. And then when you also have kind of the overall community and agricultural bureaucracy also kind of against you. So the question really was, well, how do we educate like basically all of society? And at the very end, I put something in the chat about maybe even reaching out to future farmers of America, because that's where it's got to be, is for the future farmers. So that's it.
Great summary. It sounds like it was a robust discussion, and I agree that there's education on multiple sides. I think when we framed up that conversation, we're thinking more on the side around who's helping farmers, those advisors helping farmers and farmers themselves, but there's that huge piece around consumer education, and farmers need support with that. So thank you for bringing that forward. The next breakout room that we had was on the transition to organic partnership program. We had several people in the breakout room who are really actively engaged in that program in some way, shape, or form. And I'm going to turn it over to Roz to kind of give that report back from that room.
Okay, thank you, Abby. Um, so we started out our discussion. We were just we spent a lot of our time kind of just everybody having a chance to talk about the presentation and just provide some anecdotal feedback on what they're experiencing in their areas. So we did talk about those trends and if we're seeing those and if anything really popped out in terms of what we were hearing from farmers in regards to why they might be leaving their operations. Um, uh, two big things kind of came out. One was well, now I just lost I did not get my notes ready in order. I'm sorry. Um, One thing that came out of just the hearing the data in the presentation was maybe understanding a little bit more of how the organic market development grants, how that might be playing out over the next few years and what the goals were for some of those grants, and just for some projection to maybe so farmers could see where their crop might be going after those transition years. That could be helpful to get a report out there. Um, Another thought too was looking at TOPP. A lot of folks were really excited about the resources that we were able to provide folks that were curious or transitioning into organic, and maybe they were learning. There are a lot of resources available to learn the process, but when it really came down to making the decision to apply or go through the work to become certified, they didn't go all the way when it came to receiving those resources. And so maybe understanding a little bit more of how to cross that finish line when it came to some of the work that was being done behind the scenes with TOPP. Let's see. And I know that some certifiers might collect that information and some not, but how those certifiers could relay that information, and if they want to work with those TOPP programs to kind of fill in those gaps to focus on retention. And then I think one of the other things that I heard towards the end of the conversation was how SOE is really smaller. The smaller scale producers are really struggling with the changes to SOE and feeling, and I'm sure a lot of folks are feeling that pressure, whether it's the inspectors making sure they're following the rules. But I think it's really trickling down to some of those producers who, at the end of the day, are having to make the decision: is this really worth it? When we're all in it for, most of us are in it for those for the big picture reasons, right? And not just looking for a quick market upturn for their operation. So how maybe TOPP through our remaining months might be able to step in and support some of those SOE struggles. Abby, feel free to jump in if you feel like I'm missing anything.
Yeah, just to put a little exclamation point on the last topic that you're talking about, maybe our presenters in the presentation of the reasons why people are leaving, there wasn't a huge emphasis or a large attribution to. It's because of the record keeping burden, but some of the on the ground lived experience that folks shared in our breakout room is that that is something that's affecting producer decisions and maybe something that TOPP is positioned to kind of help with. It was something that came out in our discussion. Thanks, Roz, for that summary of where our conversation went and for all the folks who participated in that top focus discussion. The fourth and final breakout room was focused on policy, and we had Steve Etka facilitating, and I know we had Lily Hawkins there as well from Organic Farmers Association. Thank you, Lily, and I'll turn it over to you for that report out.
Thanks, Abby. So in our group, I think there was also a lot of folks who expressed surprise about the data showing that the regulatory burden wasn't as big of a factor for farms leaving organic as expected. Also, talking about just the amount of churn in the data and like farms leaving and farms coming in. Then we spent a lot of time talking about how that information sort of resonated with folks on the ground experience and then how that related back to policy. And I'll summarize briefly. I think that market access and policy to support market access came out as kind of a top concern for folks. Dealing with, that could be also dealing with consolidation or competition with imports. And then we talked about the need for consistency of messaging in policy, and how we can all tend to generalize from our individual perspectives, whether it's geographical or what commodity we're producing, and how important it is to think beyond that kind of first person experience so that when we're messaging during advocacy, we're not saying things that seem to contradict each other to members of Congress. And then I would say we also talked a bit about the need for policies to support education and certifier training for consistency among trainers. And am I missing anything there, Steve?
No, I think you've got it. I just wanted to say that there was a lot of overlap between what we just heard from the other three groups and what we heard in our group. Perhaps not surprisingly, like you mentioned, Lily, the certifier training issue. But another thing I heard, I think from you, Mallory, was about people commenting on the challenges because of lack of support for organic in their communities and the negative attitude of conventional farmers toward organic. I think that's more of a barrier to getting in, but perhaps it's also a reason that some folks are getting out and finding that organic is just too hard for them. So those were some other things that I wanted to point out. And as Lily said, there was a lot of interest about the data showing that maybe the regulatory paperwork burden is not as much of a driving force as sometimes we hear. And I think a comment was made that we really are hearing two different stories on that. And maybe what we need to do is drill down and be asking the question more directly, like for whom is the regulatory paperwork burden a driving force, and what do we do about that? But nothing else to add. Thanks, Lily.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you for the great summary and that nuance of it might be true that for some producers, it's not the regulatory burden, it's not the paperwork, but for a set of producers, it very much is that issue. And so maybe both things are true, but it's about which groups we're talking about when we tell those stories. So I think that's an important point. And we somehow, as an organic community, have to keep a lot of different issues in focus when we think about policy and we think about what kind of support farmers need. So thank you for those report backs. This is the group that kind of stuck with it to the end and was able to engage a little bit more with some of what we heard today. And I really appreciate the perspectives that folks shared in the breakout rooms. As we wrap up, I want to express appreciation again to Mallory and Dr. Dimitri, really the engines behind this session with the analysis and perspectives that you brought forward. And I also just want to express appreciation. There were a lot of colleagues who stepped forward to help facilitate and take notes during the breakout room discussions. We really appreciate you stepping forward. NOC has a pretty lean team, so we always appreciate help from colleagues to make sure we can have something that is participatory. We also want to let you know that we value your feedback about what worked about the session, if you have ideas for future sessions, and we're going to post a link to a survey in the chat box and just welcome you to share feedback in that way. It's a very brief survey, but we'll take a close look at what we hear. We did record this session, and we are going to make that recording available to folks. And so we will put that on the resource page for the event as soon as that's available. And we encourage you, I think many of you are subscribers to our list, but if you're not, please consider subscribing. And also, please know we do have an action alert right now. It's very directly related to the issues we've been talking about. Farmers have not yet received their certification cost share reimbursements for 2025, even though Congress did authorize those funds to be given out. And so we want to make sure they do go out to farmers. And that's an issue that we've been tracking, and we'd love your help kind of being able to encourage USDA to get that money out to farmers. So just want to draw your attention to that in case you hadn't seen that yet. I think we are done with our session, but thank you again for your partnership. Thank you for being part of the conversation, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Take care.